Welcome to this presentation for the topic of collective nouns. Let's go to the beginning slide and get started. What is a collective noun? Well, a collective noun is an odd bird. It sounds singular. There's no S at the end of a collective noun typically, but it's describing a group. It's describing something that is inherently plural. It can be a group of things, a group of animals, or a group of people. Usually the collective noun is going to refer to the group as a unit. It's not going to consider each individual person or animal or item. And so in some sense, the group has an identity separate from the individual constituents of the group. And so it's a little bit of a logical conundrum, figuring out kind of how to look at it. And having more kind of a philosophical way of viewing it can help you make some sense of this. I will tell you, though, that collective nouns can be tricky. And my practice is, unless it's a really easy one, that I'm going to look up if I'm not quite sure how to handle this. Don't see resources like the internet or grammar books as anything other than your friend. Accomplished writers use them all the time. In fact, I am never without my grammar book when I'm preparing something. I always look things up. Even if I'm 99% sure I've got it right, I'm going to check just to make sure. And so I highly, highly recommend that you do that. You're actually speeding up the process. You're not slowing it down, and you're creating a document that communicates to the person that you're sending it to, hey, I cared enough about your time to make sure I got it right the first time. And a reader really appreciates a writer that goes that extra mile, spends that extra time to make sure that the choices that the writer's making are correct. So let's look at some collective nouns. Here are some. These are ones that are quite common. A flock of birds. Of course, in this case, the word flock is our collective noun, and we can say we use the word a in front of it, which tells us it's singular. Of course, a flock has to include more than one bird. So inherently, when you think of a flock of birds, you're thinking of a group of birds, more than one bird. And so if you were to just refer to them instead of as a flock of birds, if you just said the birds, well, obviously you're talking something that is plural at that point. The birds are plural. There's more than one. But the concept of a flock, of this unit that is in some sense different from, more than, less than, however you want to look at it, each one of the individual birds, that's what we're talking about. We're focusing on the idea of flock, not so much on the idea of each one of those birds that's a member of the flock. Similarly with herd, we have a herd of cattle. There's lots of cows in that herd. If we want to talk about each one of those cows, we'd say the cows. But no, we're talking about the unit, the larger entity that happens to contain the cows, but is in some sense different than each one of the cows. And of course, it's singular, a herd of cattle. A team of basketball players. Again, let's say the team includes 5 basketball players. Let's say they're all 18-year-old men. Well, in that sense, there are 5 men on the team. And so if we want to refer to the 5 men, we would, of course, refer to it in plural way. The 5 men were late to practice. So the word tells us that we're using it in the men in a plural sense. But if we were to say the team was late to practice. That would only really make sense probably if the team were traveling together. If each one of the members just happened to be late, but they all were coming from work and school and other places, and just so happened that every single one of them was late, we probably wouldn't refer to it as the team being late. We'd probably talk about each one of the players being late. A class of students. Again, you can't have a class unless you have more than one student. You could have a classroom that's empty, but the actual class is made up of the students. You can have a gross of soup cans, and the gross is 144. But even though we know the exact number, you can't have, in a gross you can't have 143 and you can't have 145. It's got to be 144. We still use this a in front of it. You can't have a dozen eggs. Again, if you have 13 eggs, you don't have a dozen. If you have 11, you don't have a dozen, but we still refer to it as a. A committee. Going to have more than one member on the committee. A jury. Going to have more than one person on a jury. The Smith family. The Smith family includes more than one person, but we call it a family. So you can see in each one of these cases the word is actually singular that makes up the collective unit, even though it conveys or communicates a group larger than one entity in that group. Okay, so the first question to think about when you're considering using a collective noun is what verb form to use. Let's imagine for a second that in your sentence that you're writing, the collective noun is the subject of the sentence. And of course, you know that the subject of a sentence has to agree in number with the verb of the sentence. Here's an example. He is happy. We don't say he are happy. They are happy. We don't say they is happy. Now we have to match in English and in many languages we match a number in the subject and the number in the verb. The number in the subject and the number in the verb. If the sentence was he works, let me write that up here. He works. You can see we add that S, which is how we make the plural in most regular verbs. But if we want to say they work, we don't put the S, and this communicates plural for the verb. So they have to match. If we said he work, that sounds odd to us. If we say they works, that also sounds odd to us. So we need those to match. But the problem we have with collective nouns is that even though from a grammatical standpoint, these words all look singular. I mean, after all, I put this A in front of it. There's no S here. Class has an S at the end of it, but it's because it's a double S. Gross has an S because it's a double S. But the rest of these words just look like good old-fashioned singular words. So in format, they seem singular, even if in meaning they kind of imply a numerosity. So what do we use? Do we use a singular verb or a plural verb? Do we add an S to the present tense verb, or do we not add an S to the present tense verb? You know what? You can imagine a system being either way. There's a logic to either one of those approaches. And in fact, English has an answer for this, and British English has a little bit more flexibility about this than American English. So if you, as you think about this logically, decide, well, I think this makes more sense, you're in good company either way that you end up. But most of us, especially if we grew up speaking American English, are going to lean toward using a singular verb. And that's because in English we focus more on the structure than its inherent meaning. Because we have the collective noun actually in a singular structure, we're usually going to use a singular verb. So for this class, our answer is singular collective nouns take singular verbs, just like any other type of singular noun. Any kind of singular noun is going to take a singular verb. That's the answer in English. If you move to Great Britain, and I don't know what the rule is in Canada or Ireland or the Caribbean or India, there may be other rules, so obviously you're going to adapt your style there. But when you're in America, this is the way that people are going to expect you to write. If you don't follow this rule, it's going to sound weird to the ears of your listeners or your readers, and that's going to kind of take them out of the moment, so they're not fully experiencing the whatever you're trying to communicate. And it may make you sound overly informal or not very careful about your writing. And so either one of those things is a negative. So you do want to make sure when you're writing in American English to an American English audience if you have a singular noun, whether it be collective or not, that you use that singular verb. Okay. So here we have the way that we would say this in English. The team wins. We would say this. If you were in Great Britain, you might say, or actually, if you were in Great Britain, you might say the team win. That probably sounds odd to us though, right? Now, of course, collective nouns, just like any other nouns, can be plural. We say the team or a team when we're talking singular, but we could have lots of teams. Let's say we're having a tournament and there are 10 teams participating in the tournament. Well, 5 of the teams win, right? So we say the teams win. And of course, in that situation, because teams is plural, we're going to need to have the plural form of the verb. That's another reason that we want to match the singular collective noun with the singular verb, because the singular collective noun can be made plural. And if we make it plural, then what are we going to do then? If we already have the plural verb when we have it in singular form, when we make it plural, we're not really left with an alternative that makes sense. So that's another reason that we do want to match. Okay. Here's the British rule that we were talking about. The British might say the team win. That sounds odd to us. It probably sounds a little bit awkward to your ears. There are some times, though, when you're talking about a group, because we talked before that there's really two ways of looking at that collective unit. You can look at it as one unit without really focusing on the individual participants, or you can focus on the individual participants. Usually when you're focusing on the individual participants, you're not going to use the collective noun, but you can. So if you use the collective noun, but you're really narrowing down and looking at each one of the constituents within this collective noun, you can get away with using the plural verb. So here we have this example. Bob Smith's family are plumbers. And let's say in Bob Smith family, there are three members: Bob Smith, Mary Smith, and Pete Smith. They all happen to be plumbers. So we're looking at each one of the members of the family. Maybe we have a picture that we're looking at and we're pointing in our mind, metaphorically at least, at Bob and saying, yeah, he's a plumber. And oh yeah, there's Mary over there. She's a plumber. And oh yeah, Pete, yeah, he's a plumber too. And so you're really kind of breaking down and looking at each one of the members. In that situation, it can make sense to say Bob Smith's family are plumbers, even though family is singular and even though family is a collective noun. Now, I will tell you what I would probably do instead of writing this sentence is I would probably rewrite it, because this is going to sound a little bit odd to my ear, and if it sounds odd to my ear, it may well sound odd to my reader's ear. And I don't want to put them in a position, even if I'm technically right, I don't want them to be put in a position where something doesn't sound right to them, because that takes them out of the experience of reading. And they may, especially if it sounds wrong to them, they may think Groover screwed up. She wasn't careful. And even though I was careful, even though I was correct, if I'm correct and the person reading me thinks I was incorrect, well, I haven't left a good impression. It's their fault. They're the ones that are wrong. But guess what? I'm not there to explain to them what their error is. They're going to leave with the conclusion I'm wrong. So this sentence is technically correct, but I think the better course is to rewrite it to remove that question. Here's another one. Now, this one is acceptable. This one is a common one in English. The police have interviewed the suspect. It would be weird to our ears to say the police has interviewed the suspect. So this is one, I guess you could say it's kind of colloquial, or you could say that we're really focusing on each one of the police officers who interviewed the suspect. But this is one that you can get away with without anybody wincing inside. Okay, now let's talk about so we've talked about what verb the collective noun takes. That's usually not the problem. The problem is usually having to do with the pronoun that is appropriate. We already know that if a noun is singular, it needs to be replaced. If it's going to be replaced, it needs to be replaced by a singular pronoun. Here's an example. The boy likes to fish. He likes to fish. We wouldn't say they like to fish, would we? The boy likes to fish. They like to fish. Well, if we said this, the reader would not think that we were referring to the boy when we say they, right? Because that's not the word we use. So boy requires the use of a singular pronoun. Boy's masculine, so we use he. If it were a girl, we would say obviously she. If it were a dog, we would say it. Okay, so that's how that works. We need to match number, and if there's a gender associated with it, we want to match the gender. Oops, that one doesn't match. Here we go, the boy and he. This one, none of you are going to mess up on. It's pretty straightforward. The same rule applies if the noun is singular. But again, we have that, while it's the same rule, we're going to have a bit of a hesitation, because boy not only is grammatically singular, it also conceptually is singular. There's just one fellow there. And so it's really easy for us to decide to use he. But let's take this sentence. The jury considered the evidence. It considered the evidence. That is correct. The jury is it. The jury is singular, so we have to use a singular pronoun. But my guess is many of us in spoken English would say this: the jury consider the evidence. They consider the evidence. And what we're doing here is we're not talking they. The antecedent for they really isn't jury, but it's the jury members, right? We don't really have the antecedent, but it's kind of implied, right? Because when we get a mental image of the jury, we see 12 men and women, or 6 men and women, or whatever the jury is, more than one at least. And so we have this image of our head of lots of people. And how do we describe lots of people? We use the word they. So in everyday conversation, you and I do this. Is it technically incorrect? I suppose it is, but you know what? You and I are going to continue to do this, and it's not a big deal. In fact, I would say virtually all of us from time to time are going to fall into this trap in spoken English. The jury consider the evidence, they consider the evidence. It would be better to say it. It would be more grammatically precise, but I don't think there's going to be too much confusion, and I don't think there's going to be too many people in your audience who are going to draw negative conclusions from that. This is correct. When we're writing, though, there's a higher standard because, when I speak, I don't have, 3 or 4 minutes to consider, now, what will my next sentence be? What will I say in my next sentence? No, it's extemporaneous. It kind of comes out with me not even really knowing where I'm going with the sentence, right? It's almost like it's magic. It just comes out. But when we write, we have the ability to rewrite, to pause, to look up rules, to fashion it so that it is precise. And that's an advantage to writing that we don't have in spoken language. A disadvantage to writing that exists, though, is that when we have spoken language, there's a give and take between the listener and the speaker. Also, the speaker can change his or her intonation, emphasize certain words, use eye contact and hand motions and other ways of communicating meaning. That stuff is, for the most part, not available to the writer. So he or she, the writer who is trying to communicate the information, really is stuck with just using words. And so it's additionally important that he or she be precise. He has the time, he has the ability to be precise, and he has the need to be precise. So for this reason, while we might get away with saying the jury consider the evidence, they consider the evidence, in spoken English, that's probably okay. In written English, that is not going to fly. That is not going to leave a good impression on your reader. It also creates the possibility of confusion because they, who's they? You have jury there. Is somebody else other than the jury considering the evidence? Are the attorneys considering the evidence or the witnesses? No, I'm not sure. There's at least an opportunity for some confusion. So we need it when we are writing. Now you may think, well, let's imagine that the jury is made up only of men. You may have seen the movie 12 Angry Men. That was back when many juries just included men. And let's imagine we had just watched that movie and we're talking about the jury. The jury considered the evidence. You might think, well, can't we say he here or can't we say they? Well, no, it is true that all of the members of the jury were men, but the jury itself is neither male nor female. It is not any one of those single men. Even if there's only men on the jury or even if there's only women on the jury, it remains it because, again, it is in some sense conceptually separate from its constituents. So therefore, we have to use it. And that's really true for any collective noun. You're going to find us using it. Of course, this is another rule that's pretty straightforward. We all know this. If we have a plural noun, we're going to replace it with a plural pronoun. So let's look at this sentence. This time, the girls like to fish. Well, girls is plural, and so we have to replace it with a plural pronoun. Our plural pronoun in English is they. If we had it be boys, we would say they, because there's no plural masculine form here, so we just say they. They includes he, she, it. If we were to say the dogs like to fish, we would also say they. There's just one word. It's a catch everything type of situation. I'm going to go back to our original sentence. The girls like to fish. They like to fish. Now, let's imagine that we had more than one jury in our particular situation. Let's say in a particular courthouse there happened to be 7 jury trials going on. Well, when we refer to all 7 of those juries, we absolutely will use the term they, because juries is plural. The juries, they deliberated over the facts of their cases. So the takeaway is juries can be singular or plural. If they're singular, we're going to use it. If they're plural, we're going to use they. Okay, so let's pause for a second and talk about the dreadful, awful, terrible they. They gets us so many times, and it's, let me first of all start by saying, what I'm about to say, I do all the time in spoken English. Sometimes I catch myself doing it, sometimes I do it and I'm not even aware that I'm doing it. It's how automatic it is. What I'm about to say, we all do in spoken English, and it's okay. It's accepted. Nobody winces. Or if there are a few grammar nerds out there that do wince, we can live with that. But in spoken English, when we say they, we have to really mean they. So let's talk about the problem with they. In informal spoken English, speakers often will use they to replace a singular noun, especially when the speaker doesn't know the gender of the singular noun. Let's give this example. The teacher gave each student their assignment. That's what most of us would say, and that's okay for spoken English. But let's imagine it's a class of 20 students. There's going to be some men amongst those 20. There's going to be some women amongst those 20. So that's probably why the speaker didn't say his assignment, because if he had said that, it sounds like, well, what about the women in the class who happen to be students? Don't they get their assignments? But if I had said her assignment, each student gets her assignment, well, what about the men in the class? Aren't they getting their assignments? So you can see it looks like we're excluding. So the way to fix this is to say the teacher gave each student his or her assignment. But you know what? Especially in spoken English, that sounds wordy and overly formal and overly technical. And so most of us don't say that. It just sounds a little awkward and a little over the top, maybe. Another way to fix it is to make to change our antecedent noun, the noun that we are replacing with the pronoun. And we could say the teacher gave all the students. So once we make the antecedent noun, which was students, into the plural noun students, we're okay, because now we can say there. So that's a good solution to the problem in written English. And of course, when you're writing, you have the opportunity to look and say, okay, I'm using that. Where is my antecedent noun? Is it plural or singular? Oh, it's plural. I'm in good shape. Or, oh no, my antecedent noun is singular. How am I going to fix it? Can I change my antecedent noun to a plural form? Sometimes that's a good fix. But let's say it doesn't make sense in the sentence, or you don't want to do that for whatever reason. Well, then what you might need to do is use a his or her or some other structure. Or you might just do this. Here's another possibly the assignment, especially if the teacher is giving each student the exact same document. That might make sense. Of course, you kind of have to know a little bit more information before you can figure that one out. So keep in mind, don't use they as a catch-all when you don't know the gender. A good rule of thumb that I do, this isn't just for collective nouns, is when I have a document, I will do a word search for all the they, them, and theirs in my document. And when I come across that word, then I will look and see what my antecedent is. And you know what? If it's a very long document and all, I invariably will catch a time where I use they and my antecedent noun is singular and I have to rewrite it. Better that I caught it and correct that error than my reader catch it and think, Graver doesn't. Not very high attention to detail here. So be sure that you're catching them so that your reader isn't the one catching them. Okay. So because singular collective nouns have an inherent plural meaning, speakers do often say they to replace the collective noun. Here's an example. The team scored at the buzzer. They won. Again, we would all say that because what we're really thinking is the team members won. We saw them cheering, hugging each other, jumping up and down. We saw that. We saw individuals participate in that. And when we see a group of people, we think they. Okay? But our antecedent noun for they is team, and team is singular. So what we should have said, if we're writing this especially, is we should have written, the team scored at the buzzer, it won. Even if it's a team of completely girls, it's still it. or a team completely of boys, it's still it. So we cannot use the they in this context. And of course, if we're just talking about one team, we can't change it to teams if we really mean there was just one team who scored at the buzzer. Okay, but of course, if we have more than one team, we can use they. Another way to fix this, let's say that that this sounds too formal. We can always say the players won. We don't have to use a pronoun. We can use some other noun to replace it. The team scored at the buzzer. The players won, or some other term. So just if a pronoun isn't working, if it doesn't make grammatical sense, you have the freedom to go ahead and change your noun even to the antecedent. So you could go back and just repeat the antecedent, say the team, or use another synonym for the team, or rewrite the whole sentence. You could have done this instead. The team scored at the buzzer and won. That's another way of working through it. There's lots of ways to solve this problem, and when you're writing, you have the luxury of sitting back and playing with all the different ways to be sure that they're in good shape. So remember the scary they, beware of it, use it only when it's grammatically appropriate in written English, and this is especially important to keep track of when you're dealing with singular collective nouns. If you have any questions, please bring them to class.